What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a great day today. This is Alex from the Fresh Fantasy Podcast, and this is the 42nd episode of Season 2. Today, we're going to be talking about reception perception, and we are talking about this glorious tool. There's only one man to talk about it with. He's a football writer and analyst for Yahoo Fantasy Sports. He is the dad to the best dogs on the planet, once lost over 100 pounds, has one of the best beards in the fantasy football space, and is the creator, owner, and CEO of my favorite fantasy tool, Reception Perception. He is Matt Harmon. Welcome back to the show.
That sounds all really good when you read it off like that. Sounds like we're doing all right here. No, I appreciate you having me on, man. I'm excited to talk with you, and I can't believe that it's been so long since last I was on the show and how much you've done since then. And I love seeing you chime in the RP Discord as well. Like, I'm happy for you, man, and I'm glad to be on the show.
I appreciate having you. One of the things that's kind of interesting that I was thinking about before the show this morning was the last time I had you onto the show. I don't know about the exact date, but it's right about a year, almost to the day. And when I had you on the show, the first thing you said after I introduced you and all that was, "Can you really believe we're going to have a football season?" We were like, "It seems like we're coming out of the clouds." And you were saying that you were one of the people that was negative about there even being a football season. And then we went on to have every single game, no canceled games. So how does it feel that it seems like, obviously there's new variants and stuff that could come up, but it seems like we're going to get another full season without any trouble this year? Besides, there'll be some missed games, but no actual canceled games, we hope, at least.
Right. Like we already have a player out for Thursday night. Most likely Zach Martin's going to miss that game, like a big name too, and it's kind of tough that right on the back end of that, the Bucks activate and Ndamukong Suh off their own COVID list, and then a starting guard for the Cowboys goes on the COVID list. So pretty tough juxtaposition there. But no, I mean, I was definitely, I guess, pleasantly surprised that how they pulled off last season, and they just kind of pushed through, and it is what it is, and I'm just glad that we have football. Like, I'm always glad that we have football. Yeah. I'm glad that it's in our lives and everything. So yeah, no, I mean, I'm this year. Obviously, I was kind of more hopeful that COVID would be like. I mean, maybe I was stupid for thinking that it was not going to be as big of a story as it is and will be and has been so far. But no, I mean, as long as we get a full season and guys are able to go out there and do their thing, like I'm happy. I'm cool with it.
Yeah, I know. Me too. Again, as long as we get it in some capacity, I'm happy. And again, as long as everybody's safe, but it seems like there's a good chance that people will be pretty safe this year because there's a higher vaccination rate. We don't have to get into all that. But today,
we'd be great. We'd be great, like a gravy as a country if we were anywhere close to the damn NFL and like how they've been able to get everybody vaccinated and everything. So yeah, no, I mean, I would say too, though, this is probably unrelated, non-COVID-ish, but I feel like, and maybe you agree or disagree, but I feel like this August in particular absolutely like snuck up on me. I can't believe we have games this week. Like, I'm sitting here, we got, our week 1 assignments for Yahoo and everything. And like, oh man, all this stuff that we've been talking about theoretically doing all summer, like it's really happening now. So I guess maybe I'm just always at the point where because I do so much in the off season with the charting and reception perception that, you sort of like just turn the brain off for like the month of July, and then bam, it hits you so hard here in training camp and then everything like that.
Well, it really does. Because again, like last year I started the podcast in July. So I never had, this is like my first like full season going from about April until now. So it for a long time has felt like this endless slog of just like talking about football, like if it's going to happen. And then, finally we're here, and it is not set in that we have this. We're recording this on Monday that we have games in 3 days now. So that's pretty exciting. But reception perception is a tool that I talk about all the time on the podcast and stuff like that, especially referencing wide receiver statistics and stuff like that, helping make a case for or against. Reception perception is one of the best tools, but there might be a few people right now that are listening that have no idea what it is. So if you could explain, I'm sure you have a million times, but what is reception perception and what made you want to start this?
Yeah, reception perception is the methodology that I developed pretty much back in 2013 and have collected full season data from 2014 to 2020. It's basically the methodology that I developed to better evaluate wide receiver play, because to me, Alex, like we all know this, and even if we don't recognize it, we definitely don't recognize it as much as we should, but like wide receiver production is so dependent on outside variables to happen, right? Like obviously we talk about quarterback play, but there's way more that goes into it even than that. Like there are guys that just aren't system fits with where they're playing, or maybe they're kind of stuck in that outside receiver role when maybe they could be a slot guy, something like that. So we know that there are just all these variables that go into the actual production, to the point that it's impossible to isolate wide receivers from those outside variables through any statistical measure except reception perception, because that is the goal of RP, is to isolate the wide receiver from those outside variables, to evaluate route running, which is something that gets talked about a lot, but there's no hard and fast, like, this guy is this type of route runner or anything like that. It's more just something that is thrown around on a narrative basis, but that's what reception perception is trying to evaluate, is wide receiver play, and specifically try to quantify the qualitative reality of route running. And what I do is, over an 8-game sample for NFL and college players are back this year as well, I go in and I chart every single route that they run. So you can imagine that takes a lot of time. Chart every single route that they run, how often they get open on each individual route type, how often they create separation against man, zone, press, etc., as well as some additional ancillary metrics too, like contested catch rate or what they're doing after the catch as well. So basically trying to, again, isolate the wide receiver as much as possible, but also just become the source for good wide receiver information is what reception perception is trying to be at this point, now that it's its own site. And the reason I started it is basically kind of what I said at the beginning was, for me, it's kind of a two-part thing. Number one, I wanted to get into football media. I wanted to break into the space, and I was a total nobody, still a total nobody. But even then, like, I had no connections. I didn't know anybody in media. I obviously did not play in the NFL, stuff like that. So it was like, how am I going to stand out in a very crowded space of a lot of people that want to get a job like this? I figured I needed something unique that was specifically known to me and to, my, even if I didn't say it, like my brand or whatever. Right. So that's was kind of the goal there with reception perception, was to create unique content, but also it was just trying to answer a question that I had about football, which is, on Sundays, like this Sundays we're going to see the receivers run off the screen, and like, we don't know what they're doing. I figured somebody's got to try to go in and record what they're doing on a route by route basis. And that was sort of the inspiration for the whole series.
I love it. I think it's such a cool inspiration. I'm sure it takes some, you talk about that you're in film prison for so long before you start charting.
Route prison. Yeah.
Oh man, but there's probably no one that has probably watched more slant routes and curl routes than you have. So I mean, a lot of respect to that.
Yeah.
But it's one of the reasons that makes this tool so great, and the fact that you launched your own site for it this year, and you have a big enough following. And like I said, I'm part of the Discord of the many subscribers to it, and I'm sure there's so many more that aren't even in the Discord, which is a shame for them. But with that being said, let's jump right into the actual reception perception of the players. So you charted a lot of guys, you look at a lot of routes, and I think, again, as well as I do, there's a lot of people in media and stuff that look at the eye test that may or may not know what they're talking about. But I think reception perception is one of the ways analytically to look at who really is a great route runner, who's not a great route runner and stuff, and it's more than just the eye test. So after charting these routes, what was the player that you were most surprised about that really rose up your rankings, that you were like, holy moly, like this guy is a lot better than people realize, or a lot better than I realized?
Yeah, I think there's probably two names to go on here, one upper tier guy and one lower tier guy. The biggest one, and this was early on in the charting process, was Brandon Ayuk for the 49ers. I've talked about this a lot this offseason, but I figured coming into the NFL, and I think most people thought this too, that he would be kind of a create a touch player, like a gadget type guy or whatever. But that was not the case. I figured he'd be sort of like another Deebo Samuel for them, but he was really winning at a high level outside as their traditional X receiver, which has been a big position when they've had one in that Kyle Shanahan offense. Think about the Andre Johnson days from the Houston Texans. That feels like 1,000 years ago. Even Julio Jones, obviously, with the Falcons, but they've rarely had that guy in San Francisco. But I think Ayuk is that next guy. He won at an 88th percentile level in a success rate versus man coverage, which is, of course, the main reception perception metric. So I did not expect that from him at all. I'm very bullish on him as a player. Obviously, there are some questions about volume and the overall offense. Like, there are some teams, we just kind of went through this process, which is actually going to lead into my next player with the Patriots offense, and how this setup now changes dramatically from when they were a Cam Newton-driven offense to now a Mac Jones-driven offense. That's definitely the same case with who starts at quarterback for the 49ers, right? That's going to change the overall complexion of the offense from a run versus pass standpoint, but also Trey Lance could boost the efficiency of that team as well. So I'm kind of just laser focused on Ayuk's ability and thinking that he can become that next superstar receiver. I'm that high on him as a player. And my next guy, to kind of dovetail that point there, is Jacoby Myers. Again, similar situation with overall what's the offense going to look like, whether it's obviously now it's going to be Mac Jones right from the jump, which I think is probably good for the overall passing volume for guys like obviously Myers, but also they added guys a lot of guys this year too, but I don't think that is an indication that they're not very excited about Jacoby Myers. This is a guy that's been out there every single snap with the starters for preseason. I think he's going to be their top targeted player this year. And I think he's good. Like that he was a later guy that I charted after the final data dump, like in mass in July. He was a guy that I ended up adding later. And I was really interested to see what type of player he was, but he was a very good separator, really underrated route runner. And you just go back and look at his production from last year, like in the final 8 games when he was established as a starter after Julian Edelman went down. He was producing within the context of that really bad Patriots passing game with Cam Newton last year. So those two guys to me, I think, were really big risers. Very surprised at how good they were, especially Ayuk, who, I think Myers can be a solid starting receiver in the NFL. I think Brandon Ayuk could be a superstar in the next few years.
Yeah, I love both of those guys. Both guys I've been super high on. I think, beyond just reception perception with both of them, there's been a lot of really smart people on Twitter, analysts and stuff like that are very in on both of those guys. And there really hasn't been much of a case against. The only case against Ayuk, like you mentioned, is just the quarterback play in the offense. How does maybe a rookie quarterback affect how much volume that he gets? But Myers is the guy that is probably my highest owned or second highest owned very late round player. Between him, Elijah Moore, and Marquez Callaway for me. I have tons and tons of shares of all those guys, but enough about that. Who is the biggest faller? So obviously you mentioned a couple guys that you're like, wow, these guys surprised me, but there has to be some. I know we don't like a lot of negativity out here, but who's the guy that maybe they say on the outside is a really good route runner, or someone that gets open a lot, or better or worse for a situation, is a guy that kind of fell in your rankings a little bit after charting them?
Yeah, and I'll say this too about reception perception. I think it's a much better tool for spotting breakouts or telling us, as it says on the website, the cute little tagline, telling us, quote, who is good before they're good or whatever. I think that's it's really good for that. I've become less convinced that it's really helpful, when that it's let me just put it this way. Not that it's not helpful to show us who is bad, but because there's a lot of guys when they just don't get open, they never end up producing for fantasy or becoming a useful player. But I think contextualizing negative results is much more important. And I'm very, very confident in the hit rate for certain thresholds for the high end of success rate versus coverage. But on the lower end, there are always ways that you can get around negative scores. For example, if you're a player like a Juju Smith-Schuster who's never been a good player versus man or press coverage, and I think that's why so many guys have usurped him in that passing game where he's never become a true number one receiver. But that's fine. That doesn't mean that he's a bad player. He's a pretty useful starting player. He's obviously a guy who thrives really well out of the slot. So there's always that sort of context that needs to be brought to it. A couple of negative players that I typically get done my charting and then do my ranking, so I wouldn't say that they fell or anything like that. But Jalen Reagor, really negative result from his first season. He was the second worst success rate versus man coverage score ever charted since 2014. They're over Justin Hunter.
Okay.
So fair. That's not a name you want to be compared to. But I actually think it's interesting too. I really have been meaning to put a thread about this on Twitter just to get it out there, but I keep forgetting. So I'll just talk about it here on the podcast. I think that when you actually look at the bottom 5 guys who are not slot receivers, outside receivers that have been in the bottom 5 in success rate versus man coverage in the historical databases, it's Justin Hunter, Jalen Reagor, Marquis Lee, Devante Parker, and then Devante Adams, all of their rookie years for these guys.
Wow.
So the interesting, and I think that actually can, that's to me is a perfect range of outcomes for Jalen Reagor. The two very unlikely ones are Adams, and Hunter. Because Hunter was a guy that just washed out of the league, never did anything, was a total bust. And once he got off the Titans, we never heard from him again. I don't even know if he was ever on a second team. So there's that in the range of outcomes for Reagor, but I think that's probably unlikely. Then there's the Devante Adams one, who has gone from, bottom 5 to one of the top 10 scores ever, 99th percentile in 2018, was right there again this year. He's gone from one of the worst receivers in the league to being one of the 2 or 3 best in the league. I think that is a very unlikely in the range of outcomes for Jalen Reagor. I don't think that's going to happen. The 2 middle ones are the more interesting ones to me. Like Marquis Lee was a guy who had some moments in the NFL. He's been on a few rosters. I know he opted out of last season, so maybe that's like put his career trajectory kind of in complete question. But he had some moments for the Jaguars, right? Like he had a year where he had over 700 yards. I think that's a potential, but he's not a good receiver and is not somebody you want starting. I think that is a possible, a more likely range of outcomes for Jalen Reagor. And then the other one is Devante Parker, who is like, what would you say, Alex? I would say he's like a average starting receiver,
Absolutely.
I think that is also in the range of outcomes for Jalen Reagor too. So I actually think that bottom 5, and this is why it would make a really compelling Twitter thread or an article or something like that. There's just, I think that perfectly shows what could happen with Reagor. Obviously, I'm not really high on him for fantasy this year because there's the questions about his own individual ability and then also the entire offense as well. So he was a guy that I really liked Jalen Reagor coming to the NFL. And again, I think he could still be a useful player because he's fast and he's athletic and everything. You just got to learn how to run routes because he looked like he was at square one with that last year.
Yep. Absolutely. It's interesting. Like you said, there's so many range of outcomes. And I think that either Devante Adams will be one of just the great success stories in RP history, or maybe, there could be more players that just don't start out well and they continue to get better. But I think it's also interesting, the testament of who's willing to put in the work. I mean, Devante Adams, that guy obviously has to work as hard as just about anybody to get from the bottom to where he is today. But beyond the risers and the followers, I want to get into some specifics. And there's no better way to start, especially for fans of my podcast, than Deontay Johnson. Matt, thanks to you, Deontay Johnson helped me win a lot of leagues last year. I think I had him in 9 out of 11 leagues, which is definitely my highest owned player, but I had to. Is because you said from reception perception, all the metrics and everything we had seen in camp, all the reports said Deontay Johnson to the moon. And I think people forget, I think his season last year was still so underrated beyond reception perception. I have in my notes that he was the wide receiver 7 in half PPR from week 6 on, and he missed week 6. I mean, the dude is just absolutely ridiculous, and reception numbers absolutely amazing. So please tell us all. People have heard it enough from me. Why is Deontay Johnson so great, and how well do you have him in your rankings right now?
Yeah, I know you're a big Deontay Johnson guy, so I'm happy that we can share this on the podcast together because I think he is really still very underrated. Obviously there's the drops and everything like that. People get their feelings hurt by that. People get their feelings hurt by him missing time and leaving games early with injuries. And obviously he could be a more reliable player, sure. But at the same time, I think a lot of those drops last year were a factor of how they were using him and where they were targeting him on the field. And I think that all those little stupid slant routes that were just right out of Ben Roethlisberger's hands in like 1.5 seconds. Next Gen Stats has put out the chart. You can find this on Twitter. That's where most drops happen, and it makes sense, right? Because you're getting the ball out so quick. It's difficult to track, when that thing's coming on you so quickly. So it can clank off your hands overall. But I think they were really only using him that way because it was like an extension of the running game. They had nothing going on as a rushing attack last year, so I think they had to put Johnson, who they clearly view as their best receiver. That's why Ben Roethlisberger threw him the ball so much last year and why he played so many snaps and only lost playing time because of drops for like 1.5 of a game, like not even a full game or whatever. So really like 1.5 quarters, honestly. He eventually came back out there. So I think that they're going to probably change up his role a little bit this year, which is great because what reception perception would show you is that he is a dominant full field separator. He was number 7 in success rate versus man coverage last year, number 1 in success rate versus zone, about the 85th percentile in success rate versus press. I mean, check. Like and it's not just him running those short little routes. What you see on the route percentage chart for Deontay Johnson on the website is that he's getting open deep. He's getting open in the intermediate areas. He's running difficult outbreaking routes. He was just mostly targeted on those short plays because I think, again, extension of the running game. So I think he can be a true number one receiver. I put him in the same category from a pure player perspective. I think he's right up there with a guy like Terry McLaurin and AJ Brown and DK Metcalf, these breakout superstars from that 2019 class. I think Deontay Johnson can join those guys literally at any time. Now for fantasy, I have him pretty much at the top of my wide receiver tier 4. When I do my final rankings update, I think he'll be right up there with Brandon Ayuk as like wide receiver 20, wide receiver 21. And the only reason I can't really realistically put him higher is the overall questions about the offense. Number one, is Ben Roethlisberger still good? Number two, I do think they're going to pass less than they did last year, which is probably good for the overall health and efficiency of the offense. But, Deontay might not have the same, like I'm averaging like 12 targets a game or something like that, whereas he did last year. So extremely high on the player. I think he can be a true number one receiver that wins at every level. I don't think the drops are really necessarily a problem with his own individual skill set. Also, drops are not a sticky metric year over year, so we don't even really need to discuss that. But yeah, I think he's a great player. I think he is really still underrated in terms of where he fits in the overall NFL, like Mount Rushmore of receivers.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the thing is that people talk about drops so much, but what people don't realize about drops is drops are when they're charted open. They're not Kenny Golladay 80-20, 50-50 balls that he drops.
Yeah.
Drops are literally, he was open another 10 to 16 times depending on the site, and he didn't catch the ball. And that's a lot more yards, catches, and touchdowns potentially, again, if he caught some of those passes, which I think is a positive sign. But I think one of the things, I agree with you. Is Big Ben still good? The questions about the offense with Matt Canada and everything. But one of the things I think that goes a little bit underrated is people are downgrading him a little bit too much, in my opinion, because of Najee Harris coming in. And I did a little study on this myself. For one, the Steelers were top 2 in pass attempts 3 out of the last 4 years. But I went back all the way to 2013 and took their worst pass attempts since 2013 times Deontay Johnson's 22.9% target share last year, which includes the games that he missed. And if you multiply those pass attempts by his target share, that still comes out to 133 targets when he had 144 last year. And that includes the games that he missed. It's ridiculous. I don't think the passing volume would go down. I think it's definitely fair to question what this offense is going to look like, what Big Ben's arm is. But I think people are overrating a little bit how much the passing volume will affect Johnson. But that is enough about Deontay. People have heard me talk about him so much. But this is the last time we get to talk about him. So I'm excited to get to do that and get to talk about it with probably one of the bigger believers in Deontay since the beginning.
Absolutely.
You. But another guy that you believe in that we talked about the candle approach last year was into Odell Beckham. You said to me last year, you're like, I have the candle open just for one more year. And I think the injury is not a little bit of fair because I think that reading reception perception, I'll let you, throw the oop for you to dunk it home, is that Odell Beckham was actually pretty dang good last year. And I think that people forget that the 2 years he's played with the Browns, he's had a 24+% target share. Mm-hmm. And there's been great reports out of camp, all signs with the injury doctors and people like that I've had on my podcast have all said really good things. So what do you think, Matt? Is the candle still lit for one more year on Odell Beckham?
Oh, yeah, buddy. I'll probably keep that candle lit for as long as I can. It is unfortunate that we have another injury question this year because, as you mentioned, basically the analysis going into last year was, like we talked about it on your show, his 2019 season in reception perception was so out of the norm, like 54th percentile success rate versus man, really poor scores against press coverage as well. But we're talking about a guy that still owns 2 of the top 4 scores in RP history from his Giants days. A guy who routinely cleared the 98th percentile against press coverage. So legitimately was like the best of the best in his Giants days, and then was an average starter really at best in his first season with Cleveland. I was willing to just completely write that off to injuries, that he was playing hurt last year, everything like that. And then 2020 was really going to give us the answer. I think that what we saw out of him last year in reception perception, again, over the 90th percentile against man and press coverage, not quite up to the legendary days that he had with New York. I don't know that we're ever going to see that player again, just because the lower body injuries have stacked up so much. But I think he can still be an above average, like star level receiver. Cause we're talking about, again, like legendary. That is what I would say when like thinking about Odell Beckham as a talent back in the New York days. Now I think we're kind of getting to a point where, again, the injuries have stacked up, whatever, but I really want to buy Beckham this year because I think he is just going to be kind of the icing on the cake for an offense that was already extremely efficient last year. I'm very excited about him. I really just hope he can stay healthy. That's just like, please give us a full season of Odell playing at his peak, with this offense playing at its peak. Because I don't think I don't know about you, but I don't buy the narrative that Baker Mayfield and Odell Beckham like can't have chemistry. Like for a guy that gets open like Beckham does, you can figure it out. I think that it's basically just been coincidence as to why they haven't popped off together yet. Once Baker got comfortable in the offense, he was really rolling last year, but it wasn't like immediately once like as soon as Beckham leaves the field, Baker Mayfield's just on fire. It took a few weeks for Baker to get there as well. I think these two guys can, if they're just playing at their peaks together, I would really be excited about it.
Well, Baker talked about that in an interview recently, and we saw, like Odell Beckham's going into his third year with the Browns, and this is the first time that he's playing the second year with a coach. And then last year they had a new coach, new scheme, and with COVID and everything like that, they had no time to work on it. Baker himself said in an interview that like we didn't know what we were doing out there. He said that about him and Odell. Like we had no idea what we were doing with the offense. We were still getting used to it. And they said around when the bye week happened, right around when Baker started to get good, that's when good things happen. And then they were 5th in the NFL in neutral script pass rate last year from weeks 12 or 11 or 12 on after Odell Beckham left. I think that there's definitely a real chance that they pass the ball a lot more. I think it's the same thing with the Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs. We were fading Josh Allen last year because his connection with Diggs probably wasn't going to be good because he didn't throw the deep ball well. They weren't like historically a super high pass heavy offense. Then we saw what they did last year. So that leads into my next question.
Good comparison.
Do you think Odell Beckham has a Stephon Diggs level range of outcomes in terms of they're going around the same draft range, they're being faded for similar, arguably, reasons, but this is still a top 5 probably route running talent? I didn't say it's going to happen this year, but the talent is obviously there. Do you think that could happen this year?
I think it's within the range of outcomes because Beckham's still that good, and I think this offense is just going to be – they're going to be that good. I really am very bullish on the Browns offense overall. But the reason that it's unlikely is I like Baker Mayfield, but like he does not have Josh Allen's individual talent. Like we were all like, well, not me. I was in on Josh Allen last year, but like a lot of people were really questioning Allen, like, if he was even good coming into last year, which seems crazy, but he still always had that like just overwhelming physical ability. Baker does not have that. Diggs was still clearly on the like upward trajectory of his career. We can't confidently say that with Beckham, obviously, even if we still believe in him. And there's just no way that the Browns are going to throw the ball like the Bills threw the ball last year. No. Obviously the Bills had historically been a run heavy team. I projected them, even if I liked Diggs as a player and I drafted him like literally everywhere last year, we were kind of not expecting the Bills to throw the ball like they did last year coming into it because they had, as you mentioned, been a historically kind of run first team. But I just don't see the Browns differing that hard from their philosophy. But it doesn't really matter because the fact that wide receiver, like just the fact that a wide receiver 1 finish is within his range of outcomes where he's going in drafts means he's just an easy pick, I think.
Yep, 100%, especially where he's going right now in drafts, when he's being drafted as a wide receiver 3 in most leagues. It's just crazy to me, especially, again, just the target share alone. If you combine the talent with his target share the last 2 years and the potential of this offense, I think, again, sky's the limit for Odell Beckham. Is it going to happen? Probably not. But, again, the fact that you can get a guy in that range with that kind of potential, I think that's a must draft every single time, just like Stephon Diggs. Another guy speaking of the crazy talent, and kind of I feel like we're turning back the clock a little bit for guys that were the stars of perception the last few years. Antonio Brown, a guy that really didn't play football almost for the last 2 years, signed with the Bucs, and then within 2 weeks was playing football and then led the team in targets from like weeks 10 on last year. Absolutely ridiculous. Antonio Brown, what did you see in reception perception last year? And based off that and the time that he had to prepare and all that, what do you expect for him this year?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because we just talked about Beckham. Like, Brown was the other guy in terms of legendary status in reception perception. Was annually first or second in success rate versus man coverage with Beckham during kind of the early days of the series. And yeah, he's one of the 5 best receivers to ever play football during his peak. I think is that was kind of the level he was operating at. He is not at that level anymore, but I was, again, very pleasantly surprised with how good he was last year. He was top 5 in success rate versus zone coverage, was still at like the 88th percentile in terms of success rate versus man, was getting open at a really high level, was still a very, very good starting receiver. Again, do I think he can become peak Antonio Brown again? Probably not. I think that's probably unlikely, but if you're still like, he's being ranked. It's kind of hard. Well, it's kind of hard to rank Antonio Brown because he's like Antonio Brown, right? Like there is also that, like, I doubt it's going to happen because he's in an ecosystem now where he wants to be there. And obviously him and Brady have some like weird friendship thing, keeping each other on the straight and narrow. I don't really understand the whole dynamic, but regardless, the fact, like, there is still some, like, he could just fly off the reservation or have a legal issue. Those things are still, like, you have to kind of account for that, I guess, in rankings. But in the early portion of the offseason, especially, he was being ranked and drafted as like just a wide receiver 3 for the Bucks. But he's not just some third receiver. Like, he's Antonio Brown. He's still an extremely good football player. I think Evans, Godwin, and Brown are, like, from a talent perspective, extremely close. I think you still have to kind of put Antonio Brown in, like, the wide receiver 30-ish range or something like that, just because he is Antonio Brown. Like, there's some risk there. And obviously there's not going to be a ton. Like, I don't think Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are going to just, like, suddenly lose the wide receiver 1 role to Antonio Brown. But again, he's not just some third receiver. He's still an extremely good starter. I think you could, I don't know where you have Evans and Godwin or anything like that, but I think you kind of have to approach the Bucks receivers in one way or another. Either you have to, like, kind of fade all of them because the target share is very nebulous and, like, you really have to worry about that. Or, and this is where I come down on it, or you can just think, like, Brady is going to potentially have a historic season, like a 2013 Peyton Manning, or was 2013-2014 Peyton Manning season. Yeah, 2013, when he just, like, threw for 5,500 yards, 50 plus touchdowns. Like, I think that's totally possible for this Tampa Bay Buccaneers team. And because of that, I've been in on Evans at cost. I've been in on Godwin at cost, and absolutely in on Antonio Brown at cost.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely in on Godwin and Brown at cost. Evans, I worry about a little bit. And again, I think the historic season is possible, but Evans, and this is a stat I've used probably 100 times now. I sound like a broken record. Mike Evans had 3 or less catches in 10 out of 20 games last year.
Yeah.
Mike Evans is one of the best receivers in the NFL. I'm not hating on the talent. I'm just hating on the situation with, I mean, they're getting another year at Gronk, Antonio Brown, full off season, Gio Bernard. I mean, all these things. So Evans, I'm a little worried about. I think Godwin's a guy that I'm very in on at price. Antonio Brown, I think, is vastly underrated because I think the thing is that people fade him so much, and he could be Antonio Brown, but I think people don't talk about enough that, like, Teddy Bridgewater throwing for less than 20 touchdowns last year, I mean, had 3 receivers as top 25 wide receivers last year. And then in the stretch of after Antonio Brown's side from weeks 10 on, all 3 of those guys were top 20 wide receivers in fantasy. I think that could definitely happen again. The inconsistency week to week, I could see people not buying, but beyond reception perception, Antonio Brown specifically graded well in every metric. I mean, he was 10th in PFF receiving grade for guys that had 70-plus targets. He was 15th in the NFL in yards per route run, and he had 2 less targets than Mike Evans and Chris Godwin from the games that he played last year. That's after signing with the team less than 2 weeks and then playing. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Nothing but great reports out of camp. Again, Antonio Brown is a guy that I'm drafting as much as I can because I think that, Matt, like you said, he's going in the 30s right now. No matter, that's the highest you can rank him, and he could be the number 1 wide receiver on this Bucs team in fantasy points. And similar to Antonio Brown, what guys can you get in that range that have that high of outcomes? And I think Antonio Brown, that's another reason to draft him because he's a guy that if Mike Evans or Chris Godwin, God forbid, get hurt, he still has top 5 potential playing with Tom Brady, who has not declined, playing in a high-volume passing offense. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Again, I can't say it enough. Draft Antonio Brown. Another guy that so many people hate on, and I don't get it, but a lot of the really smart people in this industry are very in on, is Tyler Lockett. People love to talk about last year that he had 3 big games. I know it was really the Cardinals and then every other game. But I think people forget the fact this guy's still been a top 18 wide receiver each of the last 3 years, 8+ touchdowns each of the last 3 years. Tyler Lockett's a guy that you're in on, I'm in on. Please tell us more about Tyler Lockett and why we need to be drafting him this year.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier about the drops, 100% you got people, their feelings are hurt because Tyler Lockett was inconsistent last year. But what reception perception would show you is that he is still right at the top of this game. Over the 90th percentile in success rate versus man coverage, was number 3, I think, in success rate versus zone coverage as well. So still an extremely good player at playing at his peak. There's no questions with Tyler Lockett, the individual player. I think what happened last year is, like, let's be honest, he, number one, had kind of a quarterback problem last year. Like, Russ just didn't play. It was very convenient of Russ to, like, launch this whole, like, I'm not playing behind bad offensive lines and I might want to get traded campaign to begin the offseason to cover up the fact that he didn't have a good year, like, to end the year. He was playing bad individually, I think. So that was part of it. But I also just think, and this is probably why Russ was not playing well, this offense last year was so volatile. It was so big play dependent. I think one of the things that and they couldn't solve teams are playing too high on us. Like, what do we do? Brian Schottenheimer could just not find, like, a counter punch to when teams took away what they wanted to do. DK Metcalf has also talked about it. Like, we were too vertically inclined last year. It's always been run, deep play action pass on third down. And, if that doesn't work, then we punt, So he talked about that predictability himself. I think with Shane Waldron coming in, people are starting to kind of catch on, but for most of the offseason, it's been very under-discussed that this is going to be a pretty big offensive change, and I think for the better for Russ, for DK, and especially for Tyler Lockett. Like, this is going to be a much more consistent offense week to week, because if you think about it, really it's the perfect marriage of, we want to run the ball. Like, Pete Carroll obviously wants to run the ball with precision and with efficiency. The Rams style offense definitely lets you do that, but we also know that it gives their quarterback answers and gives the quarterback layups. And I think that's going to be a big difference maker for both DK, who I've moved into the top 5 in my receivers. I have him at number 5 right now. I think a wide receiver 1 overall finish is within his range of outcomes. And I also think it's going to be really big for Tyler Lockett, who I have, close to the top of my third tier receivers at wide receiver 14, which is definitely ahead of where he goes in most ADP or consensus rankings.
Yeah, I'm so in on him. It's just crazy to me. Again, we said regardless of the offense or anything like that, and I said it when I led off with Tyler Lockett. I mean, he's being drafted consensus outside the top 18 when he's finished inside the top 18 each of the last 3 years. A better offense.
Yeah, it's so bad.
Favor him. It's crazy. But again, Tyler Lockett, people are missing out. If you're not drafting him, you're going to be missing out this year. A guy that's been as consistent as it gets. And the other thing that I actually didn't know, I've been talking about Tyler Lockett a lot this year, but someone pointed this out the other day that his production really tailed off when the offense tailed off after around week 9 or 10. And people forget that he actually sprained his knee and was having a lot of trouble playing through that from week 10 on. So, it's another little factor in the Tyler Lockett fire of why he will be better this year. He's had a little bit of a groin injury in camp, but it's said to be minor, and they're just holding him back just to be safe. Similar to someone like DeAndre Swift. We do not need to get into that because people have heard me talk enough about Swift. The next guy is an enigma, a riddle, a problem. That's Will Fuller. New team, new injuries potentially this year. But again, Will Fuller on the field is someone that I think has been a lot better than people realize. And I think reception perception started to show that. So is Will Fuller a guy that you are in on or out on right now in his ADP? But I have a feeling that it just might be in.
Yeah, I'm in. Like, I think that he can easily be the best receiver on this team. I think he is, like, unless Jalen Waddle is an instant hit, I think he is the best receiver on this team. As you mentioned, he's been somewhat of an enigma, and really last year it was just kind of stunning, not just from a production angle too, but in reception perception. He was so much better against press coverage than he ever has been. He was basically just dropped into that alpha receiver role that DeAndre Hopkins vacated, and didn't just play well, but thrived. A really good success rate versus press, was overall at or above the NFL average on every route except one. So he was really a full field receiver last year. And I think if he brings that to Miami, it's going to be a perfect fit with Tua, because obviously everybody gets on Tua about being, not the most aggressive passer, or maybe he's never going to be a high volume thrower deep and outside the numbers. And that seems like, antithetical fit with a guy like Will Fuller. But if Will Fuller is getting open and separating, especially on crossing patterns, like Tua has been lighting up the field, the middle of the field in preseason. If he can be that type of guy, with Will Fuller popping off as well, I think these two could be a really good fit with each other. It's just, I wish he had been healthier during the off season. That's been kind of obviously the big question with Will Fuller, but we'll see. I really do find myself tempted to, especially because he's fallen so much in preseason rankings. I definitely find myself wanting to take him where he goes right now.
For sure. And again, another guy that I'm taking so much of, again, he's the consensus wide receiver 38 right now. But again, look at the last 3 years. Now he's produced when he's on the field. I know that is a giant when in 72 font of when, but when he's on the field, I think he's 100% worth the draft value. I know he's not playing with Deshaun Watson, but again, 2018, he was the wide receiver 23 from weeks 1 through 8 before injury. 2019, he was the wide receiver 18 from weeks 1 through 7, once again before injury. And then last year, got better once again. I know, Deshaun Watson, alpha role, everything like that, but he was the wide receiver 5 in fantasy from weeks 1 through 12 before he got suspended. It's just ridiculous. The other thing, and again, quick note for people, is Matthew Betts said this on my podcast that I was asking him about the Will Fuller injury and all that, everything like that. I said, do you think that the stuff that he took is relative to his injury? And he's like, I don't think it is. He's like, obviously, I don't do drugs. I don't know about all that kind of stuff. I mean, just a few beaver tranquilizers, as Ian Hart said. But what he was saying with Will Fuller is that Will Fuller talked about before last season. He completely changed his regimen. He hired doctors and stuff that specifically helped his training to prevent soft tissue injuries. I think we saw that last year, that he was a lot healthier. Could it be because of the beaver tranquilizers? Absolutely. But again, I'm going to lean against that. I'm going to draft Will Fuller because, again, once again, like AB, Odell Beckham, all these guys, you talk about the range of outcomes and how many guys can you get in there that you have that much upside. I think one of the things that I've tried to preach so much this fantasy season is, again, you're competing in leagues with at least 9, 11, or 15 other people. And when you're playing, you need the guys that are going to have big upside, that are going to win your weeks. Because if you're drafting a guy that doesn't have a top 20 range of outcomes, it's not going to win you a league when you're competing against 9 other guys all trying to do the same thing. But again, that is enough about that. Will Fuller, another guy that we're drafting at his price. One of the things that you talked about leading off the show was you charted rookies this year, I think for the first time, if I'm not mistaken. Again, we saw after Justin Jefferson last year and some of those other really great rookies like T. Higgins, Chase Claypool, all those guys. There's a lot of rookies that produce really well, and I think that college charting some of those guys is a great way to do that. So from charting the rookies that you did in their college samples, who is the biggest guy, another biggest riser, or the guy that you really expect a lot of at their ADP right now relative to what you saw in reception perception?
I wish it could be Rashad Bateman. But unfortunately, obviously, he's going to miss the first 3 weeks of the season. And, I don't like to – obviously, we talked about Devante Adams and, like, Jalen Reagor and that kind of dichotomy there, but I don't really like to bet on, like, what's the best case scenario? Like, let me compare it to that. But the best case scenario for Bateman would actually be Odell Beckham, who missed the first few weeks of his rookie season. And as soon as he got on the field, it was like, bang, he's right off and rolling. I don't know that that's going to happen for Rashad Bateman, especially in that offense and everything, but really love the talent. But I would say, the biggest, like, obviously was very in on Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle and Jamar Chase, like all the top guys. But a player for me who performed very similarly to Smith and Waddle as a separator was Elijah Moore. I love this guy. I think he has like the next Antonio Brown within his range of outcomes. He's that good of a separator. 95th percentile success rate versus man coverage, was really good against press in limited looks. He was almost exclusively a slot receiver for Ole Miss last year, but man, they run like their entire passing game through this guy, or at least they did last year. So I really love this player. He's also been a little banged up this offseason, but I think he's going to be ready to go for week 1. And yeah, I think he's an explosive talent, true separator at all levels. Very excited about him with the Jets. If Zach Wilson's good, Corey Davis is going to be a screaming draft value. I have him ranked ahead of consensus as well. And Elijah Moore, I think, could be an instant hit as a rookie if Zach Wilson is good. And Zach Wilson has looked very good this preseason. He's got Tony Romo all excited about him, that's for sure.
Tony Romo's excited about it. I'm excited about it. But like you said, I think with Corey Davis or with Elijah Moore, I mean, two guys that I think are massive values right now. And I think not only is it just because I think first and foremost is because people are fading because it's the Jets. People are still thinking it's Adam Gase. They're still thinking that there's no Jets guys that can produce. And, the hero Sam Darnold is gone. So how could anyone on the Jets ever be good? Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. But again, Zach Wilson's looked good. He's targeted Corey Davis a lot. We've heard nothing but amazing things out of Elijah Moore in camp and everything like that. And reception perception backs it up. So I think that Elijah Moore, in a weird way, being hurt might be a somewhat good thing, because I think that might help him produce a little bit even better this year, makes him more of a value right now, allows us to get him more at the end of drafts. But again, Elijah Moore, a guy that I already talked about before we even talked about it, is a guy that I have a lot of shares of. Him and Bateman are guys that I'm going to have a lot, especially if you have an IR slot in your leagues. Bateman is definitely a guy I'd be stashing, maybe, similar to the A.J. Brown type vibes for the rookie season, a little injury that nailed us off at the beginning, but then number one passing option when they come in. But again, Elijah Moore, Rashad Bateman, two guys that I'm absolutely in love with. But you talked about it a little bit earlier. The next question, 2 questions left for you. Jacoby Myers, a guy, obviously in the late round, that was someone that you were looking at. Elijah Moore is another guy that we talked about. But is there any other late round guys in particular that you were like, wow, like this guy really impressed me? Or later round could be anything from round 8 on, guys that you think of that could be really
Sure.
good this year.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really good options. Obviously, from round 8 on, you could look at, depending on where you draft. Like if you draft on Underdog, like best ball leagues, like Michael Gallup goes in like the 6th round. If you draft on like Yahoo, like a standard redraft league, he's going in like the 11th round. It's crazy how late you can get Michael Gallup. Like I love that guy. I have him at wide receiver 32. That's how high I am on Michael Gallup. I think he can be a great value this year. Some of the rookies we talked about as well. Curtis Samuel always has to be mentioned as a value, especially like kind of out of sight, out of mind for him with the injury this offseason. I think he can still have a huge year for Washington, but really later round guys. I'm in on the Bryan Edwards experiment. I will actually have this up by the a little bit after our conversation here, but did kind of like a very, very snapshot view of Bryan Edwards for reception perception. Like, there's not a lot to go on there. He played like 100 something snaps last year, but there was a couple of games to start the year where he was running as a clear starting X receiver. And he's basically like made my guy, John Brown, expendable in Las Vegas this year. So I really like Bryan Edwards as a dart throw there. If you can get him, the hype train has kind of started to roll for him. So you can't get him like in the 16th round like you used to be able to do or something like that. But in that kind of like 11th, 12th round range, again, you want to shoot for upside. And I think that Bryan Edwards could be like Derek Carr's new Michael Crabtree. Like think about all those good years that all those good years that Crabtree had in Oakland with Derek Carr, because he was like a reliable possession guy. Was really good in contested situations, whereas Amari Cooper was not really good in contested situations. I think that could be a really good fit for what Derek Carr needs to take this offense to the next level. So Bryan Edwards, I definitely stamp that as a good late round pick.
Absolutely. And what guys in the late round can you get that have Terrell Owens type comparisons? I know whether you agree or not, there's not many guys you can get around like wide receiver 60 or 70.
Don't think so. Yeah.
Comparisons. But again, John, I don't have any shares of Bryan Edwards, but again, I was in on the hype last year. It didn't work out so well. But again, if he's making John Brown expendable, I think that definitely speaks to the things that he can do, especially when John Brown in your Discord actually was a guy that when you were talking about after you released the massive data and the biggest reception perception drop, who do we chart next? I was one of the people that was like, okay, we have to chart John Brown. Like John Brown's a guy that we have to do because he's been a reception perception star and a guy that
I guess we should have done it. I guess we should have done it to see if there was any drop off last year, but didn't do that one. But yeah, I hope Brown lands somewhere because I drafted so much of him in best ball.
Oh man, I think he could. And again, especially even if it's later in the season, I think he's a guy that if there's a big injury somewhere and he happens to get signed on, maybe an a la Brandon Cooks type season where he signs or somewhere week 10 and all of a sudden he gets a big role and he could do some big things. Not exactly to the level of Brandon Cooks and what he did last year, but just a similar, could be a number one target on a team with some injuries, could be very interesting with John Brown. But again, those are a couple late round guys. But the last thing is, who are the guys on your teams, or not who are the guys on your teams, but we talked about a lot of different players this year, a lot of players that are good, not a lot of players that are not great in reception perception. What we're trying to do is nail breakouts here. So is there any guy or guys, plural, in particular that we didn't talk about today that are not getting enough love, or that a guy that you should really say, okay, this is a guy that you should really keep an eye on in your drafts right now?
Yeah, I think it's Michael Pittman. There's been so much, I guess, negativity around the Colts this time of year with all of like Carson Wentz's injury issues, the vaccination discussion with him, obviously some of the offensive linemen injured as well, and then also on the COVID list too. So it kind of seems like the city of Indianapolis, at least the beat writers that cover the team, are already sick of Carson Wentz. Like, you got a long way to go on this one, pal. You got to just get used to this. So there is that, but I do think that has kept quiet, like the potential breakout that could happen for Michael Pittman this year, who was much better as a separator than I think he gets credit for. I think he was also an antithetical fit with a guy like Phillip Rivers last year, who was almost exclusively, I'm not going out on a limb here. He retired. Like his arm was certainly declining last year. He was not going to throw those deep balls, but I think that Wentz theoretically could be a better fit for Pittman, who is like in line to basically lead this team in targets, no doubt about it, especially since T.Y. Hilton's been injured as well. So yeah, I really think that Pittman is a guy who isn't getting enough discussion right now as a potential breakout. Like, I think he has a top 20 season in his range of outcomes. Probably unlikely, but I think he's good enough to do it. In reception perception was in the kind of that range where you can't put him as like a Brandon Ayuk. Like, I think he's gonna be a future superstar, but could be a very good starting receiver, and maybe upside for more growth there too. But yeah, just overall want to bet on the player. And again, he's in line for so much more volume than people think.
And that's the thing that I think I would go right off of that, as I was going to say, is, I mean, just the volume alone, whether you believe in the player or not, Michael Pittman, by all accounts, seems to be their number one receiver right now, especially with T.Y. Hilton potentially could miss the season with a neck injury. He's going to be out for a long time, which means more volume for Pittman. He's going to be their number one. And anytime you can get a number one in an offense, it's going to get a lot of volume. Again, volume is always king in fantasy, talent aside. And when he has a little bit of talent, that could be very interesting for Michael Pittman this year. But I love that. But that is it for the reception perception questions. And that leads us into our final question, the favorite question. Matt, done a lot of episodes this year. This is my last regular season episode before we get into it. So you have the final flag plant of the season. We've had 41 other flag plants, and you get to lead off with the final flag plant of the Fresh Fantasy Podcast. Who is the guy that you believe in more than anyone else for this fantasy season?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I believe in this guy more than in that way of it, but a guy that I've drafted who's not a wide receiver that I've drafted on like every damn team is A.J. Dillon. I think people do not realize, number one, that A.J. Dillon is in line to just take over the Jamal Williams role, which is brought about like 10 touches per game over the last 3 years. So he has some standalone viability as a pick in like the 8th, 9th round, but also he has screaming top 10 upside if Aaron Jones is to ever get hurt. So he's like the perfect, like when you're starting to look at like, oh, do I take Zach Moss or like Leonard Fournette, like in that range of the draft? Like, no, you should take A.J. Dillon ahead of those guys every single time. It's basically what just happened with Gus Edwards could happen to A.J. Dillon, right? Like, if, again, we're not wishing for injuries here, obviously, but injuries are a reality, especially at the running back position. And A.J. Dillon has, again, he has that unreal upside if Aaron Jones is to get hurt. But again, Gus Edwards was always in line to play for the Ravens this year. And A.J. Dillon, I don't think people give enough credit that he's going to have a big role for the Packers this year, regardless of an Aaron Jones injury.
I love that. I'm a little ashamed here because I'm probably in about 13 or 14 redraft leagues this year, and I don't think I have any shares of A.J. Dillon, unfortunately. I don't hate the player. It's just because I'm like, okay, what are the chances that Aaron Jones gets injured? And that's where I'm drafting like a Will Fuller. But I think you're right. Again, especially if he goes down, and again, he does have standalone value, but if he goes down, I mean, that's a guy that's probably a top 10 running back in fantasy. No other guys challenging him for volume. We saw what he did in his one start last year where he put up huge numbers. I don't remember who they were playing, but he had massive fantasy
Titans
that 1 week. The Titans, massive for DFS, massive for redraft that week when you had him. But again, I love that. That is the first A.J. Dillon flag plant of the year. Better way to get it off. But Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Always a pleasure to have you to talk perception, everything like that. So for that, thank you so much. But do you have any closing thoughts or anything that you want to plug for the viewers? Maybe some fantasy tool that people aren't subscribed to enough that people should be getting even this close to the season?
Yeah, I would love for people to consider subscribing to receptionperception.com. In season, of course, we'll be doing the Discord. We will be doing the weekly show as well. So even though obviously all the charts and stuff, that'll be more for the off season. But yeah, we got a lot of cool stuff coming with the Discord and interacting with all of you guys for the regular season, and just a ton of content there as well. And also would love for people to subscribe to the Yahoo Fantasy Football Forecast, which is our podcast there as well, because that'll be a fun year doing that show as well.
I love it. Well, Matt, thank you so much. And like I said, for the viewers, you have to subscribe to Reception Perception. Again, I think a lot of people that probably listen to the podcast are, because I think I talk about it so much because it's such a good metric. And I think, there's not anybody that I've ever met at this point in fantasy football that doesn't know what it is for other analysts and everything like that. I think so many people use it. And I think it's going to be pretty cool for you now to have your own tool that everyone knows, everyone talks about. Again, even if you're not that interested in the Reception Perception, come in for the Discord. There's a lot of people in the Discord, a lot of smart people. You can ask Matt your questions, get in contact. Again, there's not many opportunities to get to do something like that. And again, when there's so many cool charts, so much data, there's so much for people to get. So like I said, I've been a subscriber the last 2 years, ever since I found it. I fell in love. If it was a person, I'd probably already have bought my diamond ring for it. Perception, people got to subscribe. But that is it for the show today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Fresh Fantasy Podcast. The best way that you can help me is leave a review. Love it, hate it, I want to know, because, again, that is the only way to make the podcast better. So with that being said, please leave a review. You guys already know what to do, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.